You're watching Capital City Sunday.
Good morning. This week on Capital City Sunday, what's next for redistricting after the Wisconsin Supreme Court throws out the Republican-drawn legislative maps?
The big unknown is obviously what are the boundary lines actually going to be.
As lawmakers at the Capitol ready themselves to hit the ground running in 2024, we're hearing from strategists on both sides of the aisle how Republicans think they'll maintain their edge in the legislature.
Republicans are likely to have the majority in both houses again under any scenario.
And what state Democrats need to do to make up political ground.
There are many, many miles to go before the ultimate goal for Democrats is achieved.
This as Wisconsin takes center stage in yet another crucial political year. The issues and messaging we'll see from both parties in 2024. And the life and legacy of Herb Kohl. He passed away this week at the age of 88. How his lifelong work for Wisconsin will be remembered. Thanks for joining us. I'm Sarah Massler-Donar. The decision by Wisconsin Supreme Court to toss the Republican-drawn legislative maps has created a lot of uncertainty as we head into a big political year. Because of the ruling by the liberal-leaning court, roughly half the state Senate is now up for re-election and all of the Assembly. Republicans have already suggested they'll appeal the ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court, throwing another layer of complexity onto the situation. Plus, deadlines to redraw those maps are coming up fast. And we're learning attorneys representing some Republican state senators have already asked the court to stay and reconsider its finding that the boundaries are unconstitutional. They say they can't meet the court's January 12th deadline for new maps. But in the meantime, both sides of the aisle will still need to work out their next move. This morning, we'll start with the Republicans. Republican strategist Bill McCoshen joins us. Bill, Happy New Year. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So before we look ahead to the new year, let's take a look back at a jam-packed political year. What stood out to you here in Wisconsin?
There was actually a lot of bipartisan agreement. The legislature passed the most significant reforms for shared revenue in a generation, and Governor Evers signed it. They saved the Milwaukee Brewers. They're going to keep them here another 20 plus years. Governor signed that bill. They were able to do a literacy package, the largest of its kind in our state's history, $50 million to help our kids read at grade level, first in its history, and the governor signed that. So I think there were a lot of accomplishments this year. If there was one thing that I think Republicans still have left to get done, and that's a tax cut. And they tried multiple times, couldn't find an agreement with the governor, but I think that's still on their agenda for 2024.
Let's talk redistricting now. Wisconsin lawmakers are going to be hitting the ground running in 2024. They'll still be in session, but at the same time, we have the fallout over this redistricting ruling. There will likely be an appeals effort in the works at the same time that these new maps are being drawn up. Both parties have already been working behind the scenes in preparation for this. So for the first couple months of the year, what should Republicans be focused on? Well,
I think it's important for your viewers to understand what we're talking about. We're not talking about the congressional maps. Those were drafted by Governor Evers. They were approved by the Wisconsin Supreme Court and ultimately confirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So those are not on the table. We're talking about the legislative maps. The original maps were drafted by Governor Evers. They were approved by 3 liberal justices and Brian Hagedorn, the swing justice, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said these don't follow the Voting Rights Act and rejected them. Went back to the state Supreme Court. They had 3 options. They could have drawn their own maps, they could have chosen the Republican maps, or they could have asked Governor Evers to modify. They decided to choose the Republican maps. Part of the reason for that decision, Sarah, was the amount of communities that were split up. The governor had the highest amount of communities in his maps, that 160 different communities or counties were split into different parts. In the Republican map, it was more like 100, so theirs was fewer. And I think that was part of the reason that they chose those maps. But now we're in a position where a new court majority has decided that contiguousness is the #1 criteria. Previous courts said that least change was the #1 criteria. Now we're on to contiguousness. We'll see. Republicans, I know, are going to challenge that in court, at least as it relates to Justice Protasiewicz, whether or not she could legally sit for that case. And they're going to rely on a West Virginia decision by the United States Supreme Court where they bounced a decision that a Supreme Court justice made because they received so much money from the plaintiff in that particular case. And then as it relates to Protasiewicz, she raised, according to the Democracy Campaign, $17 million. $10 million of that came from the Democratic Party of Wisconsin in large bundled donations from out-of-state donors. So I think that's something that Republicans will challenge early. We'll see how this map scenario plays out, but I think we created a pretty bad precedent where if Ann Walsh Bradley loses in 2025 to Brad Schimmel or someone else, we could see a whole nother set of maps in less than 18 months.
Well, where things stand right now, how are Republicans going to maintain their edge in the legislature? We don't know what the maps will look like at this point, but what should be the plan here?
I think the plan ought to be get your maps in. The Supreme Court didn't give the Republicans much time, or the governor for that matter. The legislature doesn't even come back till January 16th. They have to submit their maps by January 12th. I think Republicans will try and meet the court's condition. The five are that the districts are equally populated, bounded by county, precinct, ward, and town lines, include only contiguous territory, be as compact as possible, and comply with federal law. I think they will develop maps that meet those criteria while they're pursuing on another track the appeal at the U.S. Supreme Court.
So on the same topic, as the whole assembly is up for re-election, half the Senate, how will these candidates work to maybe win over those urban or suburban voters that have been a struggle to capture for the Republican Party?
Well, the Republicans have generally done well with suburban voters, with a few exceptions. President Trump has struggled, certainly in 2020, with suburban voters. He may or may not be the nominee of the Republican Party. If the primaries were today, he would be. We'll see how that impacts down ballot races, but Republicans are in a pretty good spot. I mean, they continue to win on whatever maps are before them, and that is partially because of where voters are located. Milwaukee and Dane County and Milwaukee County are the two largest producers of votes for Democrats. And it's hard for them to create a hub and spoke effect where you can split up those districts and put more Democrats in rural areas, for example. It wasn't that way 20 years ago, but it is today. Most of the votes for Democrats come from urban areas, which means Republicans are likely to have the majority in both houses again under any scenario.
So Republicans are maintaining a confidence here in keeping a majority regardless of what the maps will be drawn up as.
Yeah, I think they feel pretty good, particularly because the Wisconsin Supreme Court didn't force all 33 senators to run this time. I think that would have been their weakest link as far as a federal case. It would have clearly disenfranchised voters in the odd-numbered Senate districts. So the fact that the Supreme Court tried to keep this as focused on the Wisconsin Constitution as possible was smart politically for their purposes. But it also puts Republicans in a pretty good spot heading into the November elections.
Let's talk national here just to kind of wrap things up. President Joe Biden struggling in the polls right now. How do Republicans take advantage of that going into next year?
Well, listen, there's a lot of time for him to make up ground, and it's really going to depend on who his ultimate opponent is going to be, I believe. I think he's the weakest Democrat that Democrats could put up. I think people are rightfully concerned with his age and his mental capacity and whether or not he can do the job. But the truth is, people aren't giving him any credit for anything economically. He likes to put out a lot of statistics related to Bidenomics, and the reality is voters don't feel that. They don't buy that their situation is improving, and it's probably why 2/3 of the country thinks the nation's heading in the wrong direction. So I think he's got an uphill battle to be reelected. That doesn't mean he couldn't be reelected, and Republicans shouldn't take that for granted. But we'll see how our process plays out, and hopefully we'll have a ticket that mobilizes our side and convinces independents to come our way.
Bill McCoshen, thanks so much for the time this morning.
Thanks for having me.